Why did she raise her hand first? No one could answer that, not even the captain, who paused longer than necessary before nodding at her. She didn't look like the kind of soldier who belonged at the tip of a convoy heading into hostile ground. Not broad-shouldered, not scarred, not loud. She carried no swagger, only silence. But silence has its own kind of gravity. They doubted her frame, fragile in their eyes, but none of them knew the weight pressing into her chest every moment of every day. None of them knew she was already carrying a burden heavier than body armor, heavier than the packs strapped across their backs. It was a burden that had no name, only memory. That night before departure, she lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling of the outpost. The paint peeled above her head, curling like dried skin, shadows shifting with the sway of a single bulb. Around her, the barracks were alive with sound, boots clanging against bed frames, laughter bursting too loud, voices trading stories to keep nerves at bay. She heard all of it. She joined none of it. Her hands rested on her stomach, fingers locked together as though holding herself in place. She closed her eyes for a moment and saw not the cracked ceiling but the kitchen back home. Warm light, a radio playing too soft to identify the song, and her brother leaning against the counter with a grin that never seemed to fade. He had teased her once, long before uniforms and war, that she was too quiet to make a mark. Feather, he had called her, like you'll blow away in the first storm. She smiled now at the memory, but the smile never reached her eyes, because the storm had come, and he had been the one carried away, not her. That phone call still lived inside her bones, the hesitation before answering, the cold silence that followed when the voice on the other end broke the world into two pieces, before and after. She had stood in her parents' living room, clutching the receiver as though her grip alone could drag him back. But when the folded flag came home weeks later, she learned the cruelest truth. Some weights you never put down. She carried that flag with her in her rucksack now, folded, silent, a triangle of fabric heavier than any rifle. The morning of departure, dawn came sharp and pale, painting the mountains in streaks of ash. She laced her boots tighter than necessary, tugging each knot with a kind of desperation. Around her, the squad gathered near the vehicles, the air thick with exhaust and impatience. They cracked jokes, adjusted straps, passed around canteens. She walked toward them like a shadow threading between fire. One of the men glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "You sure you're up for this?" His voice wasn't cruel, just skeptical. She nodded once. No words. Another leaned closer to him, whispering something she didn't quite catch, though the laughter that followed told her enough. She kept her gaze fixed on the road stretching out ahead. Gravel, dust, and somewhere beyond, people waiting, families who hadn't seen supplies in weeks, who rationed hunger into smaller and smaller portions each night. That was why she raised her hand, not to prove herself to the squad, not to silence their laughter, but because she knew what it was to wait, to lose, to carry an emptiness that gnaws at the ribs. Fragile frame or not, she would not let those villagers wait any longer. The engines roared, metal groaned. She climbed into the back of the first vehicle, her rifle slung tight against her shoulder. The seats were cold, dust ground into every seam. Across from her, two soldiers argued about whether the rations this time would be edible. She listened, silent. The road began to move beneath them, a steady vibration climbing up through her boots, through her bones. As the convoy pushed out from the outpost, the air changed. The laughter quieted. Each man sank into the kind of silence soldiers know too well, the silence before a storm. The valley stretched wide, cliffs looming high on either side like stone jaws ready to close. Her eyes tracked every shadow, every ridge where rock met sky. The sun broke over the horizon, light spilling into the cracks, but it did nothing to ease the chill riding her spine. She shifted slightly, leaning her head against the window, watching the dust trail swirl behind them. The radio hissed now and then, bursts of static that never resolved into words. She closed her eyes just for a heartbeat and let the sound carry her back to the weight she bore, the silence she had chosen. Because there was something she hadn't told them. Not the captain, not the squad, not anyone. It wasn't just her brother's death that brought her here. It was what she found after. She remembered that day with too much clarity. The folded flag resting on her lap, her parents' faces hollowed out, the room thick with grief no words could touch. And later that night, when the house finally quieted, she had gone into his room, sat on his bed, looked at the posters on his wall, the books half finished on his shelf, the jacket he had left draped over a chair. She pressed her face into the sleeve and found, hidden deep in the pocket, a note. Not a letter, not even a full sentence. Just 2 words scribbled on scrap paper, for you. She never told anyone. She never knew if he meant to leave it there or if it was just something he had scribbled down absent-mindedly. But those words burned hotter than fire. They drove her to enlist. They pulled her into every training drill, every march, every sleepless night. And now, as the convoy rattled forward into dangerous ground, those 2 words pressed against her chest as though carved into her ribs. For you. The valley narrowed. The cliffs leaned closer. Her hand tightened around the strap of her rifle. The men across from her kept talking, but she heard none of it now. All she heard was the wind slicing between stone and the hiss of the radio, sharper, louder, until static broke. A voice, half a sentence, then silence. Every soldier stiffened. Eyes darted. Hands shifted toward weapons. She didn't move, didn't flinch, because deep down she knew what was coming before anyone else. She had felt it in her chest the moment the road bent into shadow. The first crack of gunfire tore the silence apart. Windows shattered. The vehicle swerved. Shouts filled the air. She pressed her shoulder against the wall, breath steady, mind sharpening. Dust exploded outside as rounds slammed into the dirt, into metal. Someone yelled for covering fire. Another voice cut through with panic. The convoy ground to a halt. The world spun into chaos. She didn't think of her fragile frame. She didn't think of their doubts. She thought only of the weight she already carried, the promise pressed into her hands with a folded flag, the words left in a jacket pocket. Her voice cut out through the storm, calm, steady. Left ridge, 3 shooters. The men turned, surprised not at her words but at her certainty. She was already moving, rifle raised, eyes locked on the shadows above. She didn't fire blindly. She waited. 1 breath, 2, then movement. Her shot cracked through the chaos. A body dropped from the ridge. Silence followed for a heartbeat before the storm returned, fiercer, angrier. But something had shifted. For the first time since she raised her hand, the men looked at her differently. Not as feather, not as glass, but as weight, solid, unshakable. She exhaled slowly, steadying her breath, and pressed her back harder against the cold steel of the vehicle. The fight wasn't over, far from it. But she was ready. And in that moment, fragile no longer meant weak. It meant something else entirely, something none of them understood yet. Not yet. How long does a second last when bullets are slicing the air? Some would say a breath, others an eternity. For her, it was both. The firefight roared around the convoy, echoing off the cliffs like thunder trapped in stone. Soldiers scrambled, shouting coordinates, rifles cracking in uneven rhythm. The smell of gunpowder coated the air, sharp and bitter, mixing with the dust rising from the valley floor. She stayed low, pressed against the cold steel of the vehicle, her cheek resting near the rifle's stock. Her eyes traced the ridges, scanning not for noise but for silence, the gaps where a shooter might hide, the stillness that betrayed a shadow. Her shot had already dropped 1, but that only sharpened the storm. They were pinned now, the convoy trapped in the jaws of the valley. A soldier beside her, Corporal Reyes, reloaded with trembling hands. His lips moved fast, muttering a prayer, though his eyes stayed fixed on the rocks. She glanced at him briefly. His fear was human, honest. She understood it because she carried her own kind, only quieter, hidden deeper. She whispered calm, "Breathe slower, don't let them hear you panic." Reyes blinked, startled by her voice. He nodded quickly, his hand steadying against the magazine. She turned back to the ridges, her breath measured, her pulse an anchor. The captain's voice crackled over the radio, strained, demanding. "Return fire, suppress the ridges, get us moving." But movement was impossible. The first vehicle's tires had been shredded, rubber torn apart by the initial barrage. Smoke bled into the air, mixing with the sun's harsh light. The convoy was a sitting target, their only hope to hold the line until air support arrived. But air support meant time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. She shifted, sliding closer to the shattered window. Dust scratched against her skin as she leaned out just enough to see. A flicker of motion, the glint of metal. She tightened her grip, squeezed the trigger. Another crack. Another body slumped against stone. The men inside the vehicle looked at her, disbelief cutting through their fear. Fragile frame. Silent soldier. Now the only one firing with precision instead of panic. But she didn't register their stares. Her mind was elsewhere, running backward. To training. To the first time, she held a rifle under the weight of instructors' doubts. "You're too small," one had said. "The recoil alone will throw you." She had said nothing then, just like now. But when the first round went off and the target at 400 meters cracked dead center, silence shifted from judgment to shock. She remembered the sting in her shoulder, the ache in her arms, but she didn't complain. Pain was nothing new. She had carried it long before enlistment. Now, as the valley raged with fire, she carried it again, quietly, steadily, invisibly. A round shattered the rear mirror above her head, glass raining down in sharp fragments. Rays flinched, ducking hard. She didn't move. Not until the echo faded. Only then did she shift her sights again, eyes narrowing on a dark patch against the cliff. She waited, stillness broke. Her shot rang out. The firefight slowed for a breath, as though the enemy, too, was recalculating. Inside the lull, another soldier spoke. Private Collins' voice cracking. "We're not gonna make it, are we?" The words cut through the air, heavier than bullets. No one answered. Even the captain over the radio said nothing. But she turned her head, eyes steady on Collins. Her voice was quiet, almost softer than the chaos outside. "We'll make it. Not for us, for them." Collins frowned, confusion flickering in his eyes. For them. She didn't explain. She didn't need to, because in her chest she wasn't thinking about soldiers or maps or strategy. She was thinking about villagers waiting in silence, rationing hope in smaller and smaller pieces. She was thinking about her brother's grin, the folded flag, the note in the jacket pocket. "For you." The fight roared again. Shadows moved high above. Rounds ricocheted against steel. Dust filled the lungs. She coughed once sharp, then steadied herself again. The captain's voice returned, harsh. "Hold until air cover arrives. Estimated 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Half an hour pinned against stone jaws, each second stretched to breaking. She didn't flinch. She lifted her rifle, aimed higher this time. One squeeze, another target dropped. Her silence became its own kind of command. Not shouted orders, not bravado, just presence. The others began to mirror her, steadying their breathing, firing with more control. Even Ray's hand stopped trembling. Minutes bled into minutes. The valley was smoke, dust, and echoes. Her shoulder burned from recoil. Her throat was raw from holding back coughs. Sweat carved paths through the dirt on her face, but she did not stop. At one point, Collins whispered again, voice cracking, "Why aren't you scared?" She almost laughed at that. Scared? She was terrified. Every nerve screamed with it. But she had learned long ago that fear can be folded, pressed down deep where no one else can see it. Her answer came quietly, almost lost beneath the roar. "Because some weights are heavier than fear." Collins stared at her, puzzled, before ducking to fire another round. He wouldn't understand. Not yet. A sharp blast shook the ground, grenade fire from the ridge. The second vehicle's hood burst into flame. Soldiers scrambled, dragging wounded out, coughing against the smoke. Shouts tangled with gunfire. The convoy was breaking. The captain barked orders frantic. Fall back, regroup behind the rocks. Men began to move, carrying the injured, firing cover shots blindly into the cliffs. The valley was chaos now, the line between survival and collapse fraying by the second. She looked at Reyes and Collins, then at the fire chewing through steel. For a moment she closed her eyes, saw her brothers grin again, heard the faint radio in their kitchen. Then she opened them sharper, colder. She moved first. Sliding out of the vehicle, boots sinking into the dust, she raised her rifle and stepped into the open. Bullets tore the ground around her, sharp bursts of stone and dirt flying against her legs. But she didn't slow. She advanced 3 paces, dropped to one knee, and fired clean into the ridge. 1, 2, 3. The enemy fire hesitated, staggered, broken by her precision. Behind her, the squad moved faster, pulling the wounded into cover, shouting to each other with renewed strength. She was the decoy now, the anchor holding the storm. Reyes shouted after her, "You'll get killed." She didn't answer, because this wasn't about survival, not hers, not anymore. It was about weight. The folded flag, the note, the villagers waiting in silence. "For you." A round scraped her arm, tearing cloth, drawing blood. She hissed but didn't falter. She fired again, another shadow collapsing on the ridge. Her vision blurred from sweat and smoke, but her focus held. Minutes bled again, time stretched. Then a sound overhead, the low thunder of aircraft slicing through sky, air support. The captain's voice cracked with relief. "Hold positions, cover fire coming in." The ridges erupted as the aircraft unleashed fire into stone. Explosions echoed across the valley, rock collapsing, dust swallowing the horizon. The enemy fire broke, shattered, scattered into silence. When it was over, the valley lay quiet, too quiet. She lowered her rifle slowly, breath ragged, hands trembling now that the storm had passed. Blood dripped from her arms, staining the dust at her knees. Around her, the men staggered out from cover, some coughing, some limping, all staring. At her. Not with doubt anymore, not with laughter, with something else, something closer to respect, though they couldn't name it. Reyes approached, eyes wide. Why'd you step out like that?" She wiped sweat from her brow, voice flat. "Because someone had to." But deep inside, the truth whispered louder. "Because I already carry more weight than this." The squad began tending to the wounded, checking the vehicles, radioing in status reports. The valley was broken, the convoy half ruined, but they were alive. And as the captain approached, his face lined with dust and exhaustion, he met her eyes for the first time without hesitation. He nodded once, nothing more, but in that nod was something she had waited for without asking, acknowledgement. Still, she didn't smile, didn't soften, because this was only the beginning. The villagers were still waiting, the mission wasn't over. She turned back to the road, the silence pressing heavier than the gunfire had. Her fragile frame bent under it but did not break. Because silence was her strength, and the weight she bore was not finished yet. Not by a long shot. How do you rebuild silence after it's been shattered by fire? The convoy sat broken in the valley, smoke curling upward like black ribbons unraveling against the pale sky. The echoes of gunfire still clung to the cliffs, long after the last bullet had fallen. Soldiers moved among the wreckage, voices low, some tending wounds, some dragging gear from ruined vehicles. She stood apart from them, her rifle slung low, her sleeve torn where blood had seeped through. The cut stung, but she hardly felt it. Pain was background noise compared to the weight inside her chest. Her eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. The captain was already on the radio, voice harsh, pressing headquarters for guidance. But she knew what he would hear before he did. She knew because missions like this always end the same: complete the objective, deliver the supplies, no excuses. And that meant moving forward. The villagers didn't care about battle reports. They didn't care about broken tires or burned-out engines. They were waiting, children with hollow eyes, mothers with hands worn down from rationing scraps, fathers who no longer promised tomorrow. She could see their faces even now, though she had never met them, because she knew what waiting looked like. She had waited, too, for a voice, for a call, for a brother who never came home. The captain finally barked orders. 2 vehicles were gone, useless. Only one remained drivable, patched with field repairs, limping but alive. Half the supplies had burned. What was left barely filled the bed of the truck. Still, it was something, and something was better than nothing. He asked for volunteers to push forward. The road would get narrower, more exposed. Risk doubled with every mile. She didn't hesitate. Her hand rose again. And again silence followed. The squad stared, not mocking this time, not laughing, just quiet, unsettled, because they had seen her in the storm. They had watched her stand in the open, her frame small but her presence immovable. Doubt no longer fit, but confusion did. Why her? Why always her? She didn't explain. She simply moved toward the remaining vehicle, her boots crunching gravel, her breath steady. Inside, she tucked herself into the back seat, resting her rifle across her lap. The others climbed in slowly, wordlessly, as though entering not just a vehicle but a choice. Ray sat beside her, his arms still shaking faintly from adrenaline. He glanced at her, then at the road, and whispered, "Why do you never say anything?" She looked at him, eyes unreadable, because silence carries farther than words. He frowned, not understanding, but she didn't clarify. She turned her gaze forward again. The engine roared weakly, the wheels grinding, and the convoy, now just a single wounded vehicle, rolled back into the jaws of the valley. The cliffs leaned closer as they moved, shadows draping across the road. The men were tense, rifles ready, eyes scanning every ridge. But the attack didn't come. Not yet. Only silence, heavy and expectant, like breath held too long. Her fingers traced the ridges of her rifle absent-mindedly, a ritual to steady herself. With each bump of the road, memories surfaced, training grounds, instructors, doubt etched into their faces. She remembered nights lying awake, body sore, mind replaying the same sentence over and over. You don't belong here. And maybe they were right. Maybe her frame wasn't built for this. But what they never understood was that belonging has nothing to do with body. It has everything to do with weight. And her weight was her brother's shadow, his laughter, his absence. The road narrowed again, cliffs so close they seemed to touch the mirrors. The driver slowed, sweat beading on his forehead. Every creak of the suspension sounded like a shot waiting to happen. Then silence broke. Not gunfire, not explosions, something worse. A figure stepped into the road. Thin, frail, a child. The vehicle screeched to a halt, tires grinding against gravel. The soldiers froze. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, his clothes torn, his eyes hollow. He raised his hands slowly, palms open. But she saw it immediately. The tension in his stance, the way his left arm stayed stiff against his side. Her breath caught. She whispered, urgent, "Don't move the truck." The captain's voice barked back, "What are you talking about? He's just a..." But she knew. She had seen it before, in training videos no one wanted to watch twice. A child with explosives strapped under rags. A child used as bait. A child turned into silence broken beyond repair. Her chest tightened. Her brother's face flashed before her eyes, his grin, his easy warmth. She felt her throat close as though grief itself had returned to choke her. The boy stepped closer. The soldiers raised rifles, voices sharp, arguing whether to fire or not. She moved before anyone else could decide. Sliding out of the vehicle, her boots touched gravel soft, deliberate. Her rifle stayed low. Her voice calm, "Stay where you are." The boy froze. His wide eyes flicked to her. He shook his head, barely perceptible, lips trembling. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to step back, to let someone else handle it, but she didn't. because silence had taught her one truth: sometimes the weight you bear is not yours to choose. She took another step. The boy's lips parted, a whisper lost in the wind. She strained to hear, the valley too quiet, the echoes of battle still hanging like ghosts. Then she caught it: 2 words. "Help me." Her throat clenched. She saw the outline under his shirt now, the straps cutting into his thin frame. Explosives, too unstable to defuse here. One wrong move, one wrong sound, and the silence would end in fire. The soldiers behind her shouted, panic in their voices. "Get back, he's wired." But she didn't move back. She lowered her rifle slowly, her eyes never leaving the boy. Her voice steady: "It's all right, I'm not leaving you." Tears welled in his eyes. His hands trembled. His lips quivered again, but no sound came. She closed the distance one more step, her heart pounding so loud it drowned the world. In that moment, she remembered holding the folded flag, the silence in her parents' living room, the note hidden in a jacket pocket. "For you." And she understood. This was the weight. Not bullets, not missions, not orders. The weight was this: the fragile frame of a boy forced to carry death he never chose. Her hands rose slowly, palms open, her voice softer now. "I'll carry it. Not you. Give it to me." The boy shook his head, sobbing. His knees buckled, his body trembling under the burden strapped to him. She reached forward carefully, her fingers brushing his sleeve. His eyes locked on hers, desperate, searching. For a second the world stilled. And then, the captain's voice behind her shouting, "We're out of time." The spell broke, the boy flinched, the straps shifted. She reacted without thought, pulling him into her arms, pressing his thin body against her chest, turning her own frame into a shield. The soldiers dove back, shouts echoing through the valley. Silence held. The device didn't trigger, not yet. She held him tighter, her voice trembling now for the first time. "I've got you. I've got you." The boy sobbed against her shoulder, shaking violently. She lowered herself to her knees, shielding him with her body, whispering again and again, as though words alone could hold back fire. Behind her, soldiers scrambled, calling for engineers, for orders, for anything. But she didn't hear them anymore. She heard only the boy's cries, and beneath them the echo of her brother's laugh. The weight pressed harder than ever. Fragile frame or not, she bore it, in silence. Because sometimes carrying isn't about strength, it's about refusal, refusal to let silence swallow another voice. The boy clung to her tighter, and for the first time in years she let herself cry, not loud, not broken, just silent tears tracing through the dirt on her face. She didn't care if the squad saw. She didn't care if the captain doubted. She cared only about the boy in her arms and the vow she carried deeper than bone: "For you." The device still ticked faint beneath the rags. Time was short, choices fewer. The road stretched ahead, merciless. And yet she stayed still, holding the boy, bearing the weight no soldier could measure. In silence. Why did she hesitate at the door, her hand trembling just above the steel handle? The squad waited inside, their voices muffled, their laughter sharp. They were already forming bonds, measuring one another, establishing the kind of trust that carried men and women through fire. Yet she lingered, as though stepping into that room meant surrendering something she had fought her whole life to protect: her silence. The briefing room smelled of stale coffee and sweat-soaked uniforms. Maps cluttered the wall, pins marking hostile routes and fallback points. She entered quietly, shoulders squared, though her frame seemed too light to carry the weight of war. Heads turned. Some glanced, nodded once, then dismissed her. Others whispered behind clenched teeth. She felt it: doubt, thick as smoke. A man at the far end, broad-shouldered with calloused hands, leaned back in his chair. "That her?" His tone wasn't cruel, just laced with disbelief. Another soldier, younger, smirked but said nothing. She set her notebook down, her hands steady now. If they wanted to doubt, let them. She had already learned that silence spoke louder than arguments. The commander began. His voice was clipped, hard edges carrying the gravity of the mission. They would be advancing on a narrow corridor, mountains curling around them like jagged teeth. Intel warned of hidden emplacements, tunnels dug into stone, men who vanished into caves like smoke. Every word drilled into her, not as information, but as weight she was expected to carry. She listened, not a question, not a correction, but in her mind the terrain unfolded with startling clarity. She had studied maps long before anyone here knew her name. She had seen the ground, touched its dust, even before command had chosen this route. A silence pressed against her lips, urging her to speak, to warn them of what she had learned years ago, but she swallowed it. They weren't ready to hear, not yet. When the meeting broke, she slipped out before the others. The hallway outside echoed with boots, yet her own steps were softer, measured. A memory tugged at her, her brother's voice, younger, full of laughter, saying she'd never belong in this world. He had gone missing in the same mountains they now studied. His file said lost in action. But she knew better. He had been abandoned, left behind when the maps proved false. That was why she was here, not just for duty, for him. Later that night she sat alone in her bunk, the hum of fluorescent lights flickering above. Her rifle lay across her knees, not polished, not broken down, just present. The others drank or argued or wrestled in the dim barracks. She stared at the steel, at the weight it carried. Not just a weapon, a promise. She whispered, almost to herself, "You will not be forgotten." Morning brought the chill of mountain air. The convoy rumbled forward, engines coughing against the cold. Dust rose behind them, clinging to their throats, their eyes. She sat pressed against the window, watching the landscape shift. Villages with silent doors, fields left barren, the scars of a war too old to name. Her hand pressed against her thigh, steadying a rhythm only she could hear. "First deployment," a voice asked beside her. A young corporal, freckles across his cheeks, eyes too green to have seen real battle. He smiled as if trying to break her silence. She nodded once. "No," she said finally, her voice low. The boy blinked, waiting for more. She didn't give it. Some truths were too heavy for strangers to carry. The convoy slowed. The mountains loomed closer, shadows stretching long fingers across the road. Every soldier stiffened. She felt it too, not fear but recognition. This was the place. The ground her brother had vanished on. The same silence. The same air. Her heart beat harder, but her face didn't change. At the checkpoint they dismounted, boots crunching on gravel. Orders were shouted, hand signals sharp. She kept to the rear, eyes scanning the ridges, the dark mouths of caves. Something stirred inside her, memory or instinct, she couldn't tell. She stepped closer to the lieutenant, the one who had dismissed her in the briefing. "There's a cut in the ridge up there," she said softly, pointing. "Too narrow for vehicles. They'll use it to funnel us." He looked at her, half annoyed, half curious. "You sure?" Her eyes didn't waver. "I've seen it before." The man hesitated, then radioed a warning. The column adjusted, men peeling out, weapons ready. Minutes later, gunfire cracked from the ridge, echoing like thunder. But they were ready. No ambush this time. They returned fire, pinned the enemy before they could vanish. When the dust settled, the lieutenant turned back to her. For the first time, he didn't look through her. "How'd you know?" She didn't answer. Not yet. Her silence was still her shield, her strength. But inside she felt something stir, vindication and the weight of memory pressing harder. She had saved them from the same trap that had taken her brother, and she wasn't done. That night as they camped in the valley, the air thick with smoke and exhaustion, she sat apart, staring into the fire. The others laughed nervously, shaking off fear with jokes. She watched their faces, tired, fragile, human. The corporal with green eyes caught her gaze and nodded once, as if to say, "I see you now." She looked away, but her heart softened for the first time. In the silence of the flames, she whispered a promise into the dark. "I will carry this weight, even if no one else does." Would it be enough? She didn't know, but the mountains were listening, and she felt the answer in the wind. Why did she wake before the others, her eyes snapping open in the half-light of dawn, heart pounding as though some unseen hand had shaken her? The valley lay in silence. save for the distant cough of an engine and the low hum of radios crackling intermittently. Smoke from last night's fire lingered, thin and gray, twisting into the pale morning sky. She sat up, careful not to disturb the corporal sleeping a few feet away, his hand still curled around his rifle like a child clinging to a toy for comfort. Her breath clouded in the cold air. She slid her boots on and walked past the rows of soldiers still buried in their coats, past the lieutenant's tent where a lantern still flickered faintly. The mountains surrounded them, jagged walls of stone, shadows deep in their folds. She hated those shadows. They swallowed sound, swallowed men, swallowed the memory of her brother. She paused at the edge of camp, scanning the ridges. Something gnawed at her gut. Not fear, not exactly, more like recognition. The wind carried the faintest sound, metal striking stone, faint but deliberate. She froze, straining her ears. It came again. She crouched, fingers brushing the ground. Not an animal, not the wind. Someone was up there. By the time the lieutenant emerged, yawning, she was already standing near the vehicles, rifle slung tight, helmet strapped. "We're being watched," she said simply. He rubbed his face, half irritated, half dismissive. "It's dawn. Everyone feels watched at dawn." But she didn't move. Her stillness carried a weight that words couldn't. Finally, he gestured to a sergeant. "Check it." Minutes later, they dragged two scouts from the rocks above. Thin men with dirt-caked clothes and eyes like wolves. Their weapons had been hidden in the scree. Without her warning, those rifles would have sung death into their camp before breakfast. The lieutenant didn't thank her. He didn't need to. His silence was different this time, not dismissal but recognition. When the convoy moved again, engines rattling against the narrow road, soldiers kept stealing glances at her. The whispers weren't mocking anymore. They were questioning, curious. Who was she, this silent figure with the fragile frame who somehow carried instincts sharper than steel? She offered no answers. Some truths weren't for sharing. Not yet. The road twisted higher, cliffs pressing in, sky shrinking to a thin ribbon above. Sweat trickled down the corporal's face as he gripped his rifle. He leaned toward her. "How do you stay so calm?" His voice was quiet, like a child confessing a fear. She looked at him, then back to the ridge. "You learn to carry what you can't put down." He frowned, not fully understanding. She didn't explain. How could she? That weight wasn't words, it was memory. A brother's laughter in the kitchen, cut short by silence. A letter that said missing but meant gone. Nights alone, training harder than anyone else until silence became her language. Hours later, the convoy halted. The lead truck had spotted something, a makeshift barrier of stones across the path. Too simple, too obvious. A trap. Soldiers dismounted, rifles sweeping the rocks. Silence pressed down heavy, broken only by the crunch of boots. The lieutenant raised his hand. "Clear it." She stepped forward. "Don't." Her voice was steady but sharp. He glanced at her, annoyed. "Why not?" She crouched near the barrier, eyes scanning the ground. The stones weren't just stacked, they were placed with purpose, angles too neat. Her hand brushed the dirt, finding the faintest thread of wire. She followed it with her eyes, heart tightening. The wire vanished into the shadows of the rocks. "Because they want us to," she said quietly. The sergeant knelt beside her, his face paling when he saw it too. Mines. Dozens of them, hidden beneath the stones, a chain waiting to sing fire through the whole convoy. One step forward and they would have lost half their force in seconds. The lieutenant cursed under his breath. For a moment, the entire squad stood still, staring at her like she wasn't real. She stood, dusting her knees, and walked back to her vehicle without another word. The silence behind her was louder than any praise. That night no one laughed at the fire. Voices were hushed, eyes thoughtful. The corporal sat closer to her than before, though he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence carried gratitude. Later, alone in her tent, she pulled a small photograph from her pocket. The edges were worn, the image faded. A boy with dark eyes, arms slung around her shoulders, both of them laughing. She traced his face with a finger, her chest tightening. "I won't let them disappear you," she whispered. I'll carry it all if I have to." A gunshot echoed in the distance, then another. She froze, stuffing the photo back into her pocket. Outside, shouts rose. The camp scrambled awake, boots thundering, rifles clicking into place. The mountains had been waiting, and now they came alive. Why was the night so quiet just before the first shot cracked through it? Soldiers would later remember the silence, not the gunfire, not the shouting, but the heavy stillness, like the whole valley had drawn in one long, cold breath and refused to let it out. She had felt it too, a pressure against her chest, a tension in the air so thick it prickled against her skin. The first bullet slammed into the dirt beside a fuel drum, sparks flew, someone shouted, then the mountains erupted. Muzzle flashes stuttered from the ridges, orange tongues biting the night. Bullets sang through canvas, tore into metal, cracked against rock. Men shouted orders, some ducking, others firing blindly into the dark. The camp had no walls, no shelter, just open ground beneath an enemy cloaked in shadows. She moved before thought, dropping low, dragging the green-eyed corporal by the collar as a burst chewed the dirt where he'd stood. His face was pale, eyes wide with the raw shock of sudden death. She shoved him behind a supply crate. "Stay down." Her own rifle was in her hands, the motion muscle-borne, seamless. She scanned the ridges, not firing yet. Everyone else was blasting at ghosts, wasting ammunition on flashes and echoes. But she watched for patterns, the rhythm of muzzle bursts, the faint shift of rock as a shooter leaned too far. Her finger squeezed once. A figure dropped. Another flash, another shot, another silence. She wasn't fighting, she was calculating. Around her, chaos. The lieutenant bellowed into his radio, voice drowned by gunfire. The sergeant scrambled to form firing lines, but men scattered, panic tearing cohesion apart. They were being pinned, pressed into the dirt, every movement punished by invisible fire. A mortar thumped from the ridge. She heard the arc before she saw it, instinct pulling her sideways. The shell landed in the heart of the camp, fire ballooning into the night. The heat slapped her skin, a scream tore from somewhere close. She tasted blood in the back of her throat. She crawled through the smoke, low, fast, every sense straining. The corporal stumbled after her, coughing. His lips trembled as he whispered, "We're not getting out." She turned sharply, eyes locking onto his. "Breathe." Just one word, sharp as steel. His shoulders stiffened. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through panic like a blade. A bullet punched into the crate beside them, splinters stinging her cheek. She didn't flinch. She pointed instead, spotting a narrow drainage ditch running out of camp. Cover. A lifeline. "Go." He shook his head, fear swallowing him whole. She pushed him hard, forcing him toward it. Another shell thumped overhead. She followed, rolling into the ditch as fire ripped the ground behind. The ditch stank of mud and oil. Water seeped into her uniform, cold against her skin. They crawled, rifles dragging through muck. Overhead, tracers zipped, green streaks against the black. The mountains spat fire and the camp screamed beneath it. She paused, chest heaving, ear pressed to the earth. Beneath the chaos, she heard it, movement, boots on rock. Enemy fighters weren't just shooting from above. They were moving closer, closing in. She tapped the corporal's arm. "They're coming." His face was pale, lips trembling. "What do we do?" Her silence held the answer, not words, action. She slid her rifle into position, eyes narrowing. The ditch curved, rising toward the ridge. Away up, away to them. Most would crawl away, seek safety, wait for rescue. But safety didn't win battles, and rescue never came fast enough. She knew that. Her brother had learned it the hard way. She climbed, hands and knees against wet stone, rifle slung, movements careful but relentless. The corporal hesitated, then followed, fear chasing him upward. Halfway up, voices carried down, harsh syllables, sharp laughter. Fighters were reloading, repositioning, thinking themselves untouchable. She pressed herself against the rock, heart steady despite the burn in her lungs. The corporal's breath shook behind her. She pressed a finger to her lips. They waited, seconds stretched. Then silence between shots, that fragile pause when a man lets himself believe he is safe. She rose just enough to see. Three silhouettes crouched behind boulders, rifles resting, one lighting a cigarette. The orange glow lit his face for a heartbeat too long. Her rifle cracked once, he dropped. The others jerked, shouting, fumbling for weapons. She fired again, calm, precise. Another fell. The third scrambled into shadow, returning fire wild and panicked. Chips of rock stung her cheek. She didn't duck, she waited. He leaned, desperate. She exhaled, squeezed. Silence. The corporal stared at her, stunned. His rifle hung limp. How do you? Move, she cut him off. No time for questions. The ridge above was crawling with more. They pressed upward, weaving between rocks, every step a gamble. Bullets snapped close, too close. The corporal fired now, clumsy but loud enough to draw attention. She corrected his aim with a hand, her touch firm, grounding him. "Don't waste it," she murmured. They crested the ridge. The camp lay below, fire and smoke painting the night. Men shouted, wounded cried out, radios screamed static. From this height it looked small, fragile, like a nest under siege. And she felt it again, that heavy ache. A memory of another ridge, another night, when she had been too far away to save her brother. Not this time. She crouched, scanning quickly. Mortar teams were setting up further along the ridge, dark outlines against the fire-lit sky. If they fired again, the camp would be ash. She touched the corporal's arm. His eyes widened as she pointed. He shook his head violently. It was suicide. Two of them against mortar crews dug into stone. But she was already moving. They slipped low, crawling along the ridge, shadows among shadows. The corporal followed, breath ragged, eyes darting, but his rifle steady now. He was learning. Fear hadn't left him. It never would. But her silence was teaching him how to carry it. Closer, the mortar tubes gleamed faintly. Fighters clustered, laughing, their confidence thick. They thought the valley was theirs. She rose into a crouch, breath steady. Her brother's face flickered in her mind, young, alive, trusting her in ways she hadn't understood then. She understood now. The first shot dropped the loader. The second cracked through the gunner's chest. Chaos erupted. Shouts, scrambling, muzzle flashes in the dark. She rolled to cover, the corporal firing beside her, wild but effective. A grenade arced from her hand, clattering against stone before blooming into fire. Shrapnel tore through bodies, screams cutting the night. One mortar tube fell silent. Another toppled. Fighters scattered, stumbling into her rifle's path. She didn't hesitate. Each shot was a weight lifted from the camp below. The corporal cried out as a bullet tore past his arm, but he kept firing, jaw set, eyes locked on hers for strength. She nodded once. He was still alive. That was enough. Minutes stretched like hours, then silence. The ridge was theirs. She stood, chest heaving, sweat chilling against her skin. The camp below still burned, but no new shells rained down. Men moved, regrouped, alive because the ridge had fallen. The corporal dropped to his knees, gasping, laughter breaking through shock. "We did it," he whispered. She didn't answer. She stared at the smoke, the flames, the fragile silhouettes of soldiers clinging to life below. They were alive, yes, but only because she had refused to stay silent, only because she had carried the weight no one else had dared. She closed her eyes, whispered into the night, "I'm still here, brother, I'm still carrying it." And the mountains, for once, seemed to listen. Why did the camp feel heavier in the morning, even though the gunfire had stopped? Smoke still clung to the valley, the acrid sting of burned fuel and blood-soaked earth. Soldiers moved like shadows among wreckage, their boots crunching over shattered crates, torn canvas, and spent casings. No one spoke above a whisper. Voices felt like they might shatter the fragile silence that clung after survival. She sat apart from the noise, perched on a rock near the broken perimeter, rifle across her knees. The sun was slow to climb, its first light catching on jagged peaks and turning the sky pale gold. She didn't look at it. Her eyes were on the men below, bandaged arms, eyes wide and hollow, the stiff movements of soldiers who had learned in one night how close death could sit beside them. The green-eyed corporal approached carefully, his arm wrapped in a crude sling. He carried 2 metal cups, steam curling from them. Without a word, he set one beside her. She glanced at it but didn't drink. "You saved us," he said softly. His voice cracked as though it wasn't sure whether to be proud or guilty. "If you hadn't." She cut him off with silence. Not harsh but final. He looked down, lips pressing tight, then sank onto the rock beside her. They sat together in stillness, steam rising between them. Behind them, the lieutenant barked orders. His voice was sharp, but his eyes betrayed something new when they flicked toward her. Respect, reluctant but undeniable. He had seen the ridge. He knew who had turned the tide, but he said nothing aloud. Commanders didn't hand out gratitude easily, and she didn't want it. What she wanted was quieter, something she couldn't name even to herself. Later, when medics moved through the camp and engineers patched holes in vehicles, she wandered away. Past the supply lines, past the perimeter, until the voices faded and only the mountain wind spoke. She followed a narrow trail cut into the slope, her boots scuffing dust into the air. Half an hour's walk brought her to a ridge overlooking the valley. The world stretched endless from there, stone ridges, shadowed valleys, the far-off shimmer of rivers carving scars into the earth. She pulled something from her pocket, the photograph. Edges frayed, colors fading. Her brother's face still clear enough to see the life in his eyes. She held it against the wind. "I'm closer," she whispered. Her chest ached. Every step through these mountains brought her nearer to where he had disappeared, nearer to the truth buried under years of silence. And yet, the closer she came, the heavier it felt. Footsteps scuffed behind her. She didn't turn until she heard the voice. "You keep walking off alone," the corporal said. He sounded nervous, maybe curious. She tucked the photo away, shoulders straightening. "Some things don't follow you back to camp." He hesitated, then stepped closer. His eyes searched her face, lingering on the faint bruise across her cheek from last night's shrapnel. Who was he? Her stomach tightened. She hadn't said anything, but he had noticed. The photo. The way her silence bent heavier at certain moments. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked out at the mountains again. For a long while, she let the silence stretch. She thought maybe he would give up, walk away. But he didn't. He just stood beside her, the sling around his arm flapping lightly in the wind. Finally she spoke. Her voice was low, steady. "My brother, he was here before. His unit didn't make it back." The corporal's throat bobbed. "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "Don't be, he's why I'm here." The wind carried her words away, but the weight stayed. For the first time, she had spoken them aloud. The silence she had carried for so long had cracked, just a little. They walked back in silence, side by side. The camp looked smaller now, more fragile against the mountains. Men worked like ants among broken gear, patching wounds both physical and unseen. That night no one sang or told jokes. They sat in small clusters, firelight flickering against tired faces. The lieutenant bent over a map, jaw tight. The sergeant sharpened a knife slowly, the sound scraping against steel. She sat with her back to a crate, eyes half closed, listening. The corporal leaned near, speaking quietly, like confessing something he wasn't sure he should. "I wanted to run," he admitted. "Last night when it started, my legs wanted to leave even if my rifle stayed, but you didn't even flinch." Her eyes opened. She studied him, the way his hand trembled slightly as he rubbed it against his knee. Fear hadn't left him. It never did. But he had fought anyway. "You stayed," she said simply. His lips parted. He looked at her like no one had ever told him that staying mattered as much as winning. The fire crackled. Beyond it, mountains loomed, darker than the night sky. Later, when she finally lay down, exhaustion pressing her bones, dreams came. Not gentle ones. Dreams of her brother, his voice calling, echoing through ridges where she could never reach. Dreams of silence, heavy, suffocating. She woke with her fists clenched, sweat chilling her skin. The camp was quiet, men shifting in their sleep, stars fading toward dawn. She sat up, her rifle beside her, and listened. The silence was still there, heavy, waiting. And she knew it wasn't finished with her yet. Why was it so quiet now? The battlefield had roared with fire, smoke, and cries hours earlier. Now only the wind moved, carrying the faint metallic scent of blood, the ash of burned earth, and the weight of everything they had endured. She sat alone on a half-collapsed wall, her rifle resting across her knees, her body still trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion and the invisible burden that never left her. The squad had survived, barely. Some carried wounds bandaged hastily with strips of torn fabric. Some bore the silent stare of men who had seen too much in too little time, yet they looked at her differently now. Not as the fragile figure they once dismissed, but as something else entirely. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They had seen the weight she carried, the silence she had mastered. One of the younger soldiers, Harris, limped over and sat near her, his helmet tucked under his arm. How do you do it?" His voice cracked, a raw mixture of awe and disbelief. "You just kept going. When the rest of us were breaking, you held the line." She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. In them he didn't see triumph, he didn't see pride, he saw something older, heavier, a grief that could not be named. She almost answered but stopped herself. Words would make it cheap. Instead, she let silence speak for her. Harris lowered his gaze, realizing he would never truly understand. The others gathered nearby, patching wounds, counting supplies, whispering in low tones. Hale, the sergeant who once doubted her most, stood a short distance away, arms folded across his chest. He didn't say a word, but his eyes followed her, studying her as though trying to solve a riddle. When the radio finally crackled, breaking the heavy quiet, everyone froze. Command's voice came through, ragged but firm. "Survivors, confirm status. Reinforcements are en route." Reinforcements. The word should have lifted their spirits, but it only deepened the silence. Because they all knew what reinforcements meant. More battles, more orders, more weight to carry. None of them celebrated. They simply absorbed it, like another stone added to a pack already too heavy. She stood, slowly. Her frame, fragile in appearance, straightened with deliberate calm. The others watched as she slung her rifle over her shoulder, adjusted her torn vest, and looked out across the blackened horizon. Smoke curled upward where lives had been lost. The air shimmered with the heat of destruction. In that moment she remembered her brother's last letter. The way he had written, "If you survive this, carry me with you. Don't let them forget I was here." He hadn't survived, but she had. And so she carried him, every day, every mission, every silence. That was the weight no soldier could measure, not bullets fired, not days survived, but the faces of those who never returned, the voices she alone remembered. Reinforcements would come, the war would continue. The world would not pause to honor the fallen, but she would, quietly, silently, always. The squad began to rise, gathering what little strength they had left, readying themselves for the next order. She didn't tell them she was tired. She didn't confess the ache in her chest that felt like it might never heal. She simply nodded once, a small gesture that seemed to give them more strength than any speech could. Hale finally approached. He looked at her, his voice low, respectful now. "You don't have to carry it all alone." She met his gaze, and for a fleeting second she almost believed him. But when she turned back to the horizon, she knew the truth. Some burdens could never be shared. Some were carved so deep into the soul that they became part of who you were. The wind rose, scattering ash into the air like drifting snow. She closed her eyes, inhaled the weight of it, and let it settle inside her. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts, and in silence she bore everything for those who couldn't anymore. When the reinforcements arrived hours later, they found not a broken squad, but a circle bound by quiet resilience, led by the one soldier they had all underestimated. The fragile frame who had carried them through hell. And as the convoy rumbled toward the next battlefield, she sat in the corner of the truck, her rifle across her lap, her eyes steady. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence said it all. It lingered, even after the engines faded into the distance. The silence of a woman who carried the immeasurable and never asked for anything in return. The silence of someone who had already given everything, yet continued to stand. The silence that would outlive them all.